This morning, I was in my local small town grocery store picking up a few things, and I overheard an interesting little exchange. One of the employees greeted a man and said, "How are you doing today?" To which he simply replied, "Ugh." I felt that. There seems to be a social fatigue. Everyone is tired, everyone is anxious, everyone is stressed. And it's not just the wear of the daily grind or the economy, it's more fundamental. It feels like we are at war against everything. Like David, who never had to rest from battles raging all around him, we've no rest from the sword. Not in a literal sense, of course, at least not yet, but in the sense that there's tension, conflict, and dissolution everywhere around us. And we're inevitably caught up in it, whether we will it to be so or not. Sometimes it feels like we are Roland making our last stand at the pass of Roncesvalles, sword in hand, striking to the left and the right in the culture wars, isolated against an ever swelling host of foes, swinging, blowing our trumpet until we gradually fall, pierced by 1,000 wounds. Now, even though it all feels chaotic, I think there's a common thread tying everything together. And in this video, I'm going to look at some ideological battles within the church, in our perception of gender roles, national identity, and even in cinema, drawing attention to a common dynamic that underlies all these conflicts, which is what I call the war on identity. Now, you might think I've got this backwards, as it might seem that what we are seeing in the culture wars is a fight to push identity. That is, to use public pressure, gaslighting, and all the levers of bureaucracy to impose the acceptance of novel identities upon everybody. And I agree that this is part of what's going on. But if we look a little deeper, I'm convinced that what is going on in the world is fundamentally a war against the concept of identity. Now, I have to warn you, this video will be substantially longer than usual. So pull up a chair, crack open a Dr. Pepper, and sit here with me for a while as we explore this. Part one: the church. I'm going to start with the Catholic Church because this is what my viewers are most familiar with. Beginning in the 20th century and culminating with the Second Vatican Council, there was a determined effort to overthrow the traditional framework of Catholic belief and worship and substitute it with a new suite of ideas and practices tailored to the sensibilities of modern man. Now, for the sake of this video, it is not relevant whether the architects of this revolution fully intended its consequences or not. I'm concerned here only with the result, namely a catastrophic rupture with the historical Catholic tradition. Of course, Catholicism has developed considerably over the centuries, as is to be expected with any long-standing belief or institution. But what makes the revolution of the 1960s so unique is not just that things changed, but that the past was positively repudiated. The traditional liturgy was castigated as clericalist, out of touch with the needs of modern man, and exemplifying an outdated ecclesiology. Similar accusations were leveled against the church's traditional theological framework, traditional piety, music, even art and architecture. In short, everything inherited from previous generations was repudiated, thrown out in a frenzy of novelty based on the optimistic belief that we could, to paraphrase the cringy hymn, sing a new church into being. It's as if Catholicism was viewed as a blank slate upon which any form and future could be written. The proliferation of new liturgies, new sacramental frameworks, new ecclesiastical structures, and new theological outlooks were all geared towards promoting this vision and towards solidifying the rupture with the past, as if to say boldly, the night of ignorance has passed. We've come into the brilliant daylight of modernity, a brave new world where the Catholic faith will be whatever mankind needs it to be. Concurrent with this message came the suppression or discouragement of everything old, most notably the traditional Latin Mass, which exemplified the old order and therefore must be destroyed. Now, while this is a Catholic YouTube channel and I am most interested in Catholic issues, I want to point out that this movement is not unique to Catholicism. We see a similar trajectory happening within the Protestant world as well, where churches and even entire denominations have effectively been co opted by progressives, using the denomination as a mouthpiece for the message. Among the Orthodox, the advance of this deconstruction is not yet as pronounced, but it's not because of any inherent resilience in Orthodoxy. Rather, it's because Orthodox communities in the West are statistically small, tight knit, and heavily ethnic, with deep ties to the old country, where the progressivist cancer is not as far along. The same problems are nevertheless surfacing in the Orthodox world. Orthodoxy in the West is facing a demographic crisis, and a majority of its adherents under age 25 express social views no different from secular youth. And attendance at the Divine Liturgy is highly skewered towards older demographics. This means that Orthodoxy doesn't possess any special immunity from the modern world. They are just a cross section of Christianity that is a few decades behind the Western branches. They too will have their own Vatican II moment once modernity catches up with them, even if they are currently too arrogant to realize it. The point is that everywhere across the Christian world, there is a growing rupture with the historic past of Christianity, which is at various stages of advancement in different Christian bodies. Part 2: Gender. Almost simultaneous with the revolution within Catholicism was the emergence of modern gender theory and the attempt to revolutionize historic gender roles. People spend a lot of time arguing about whether traditional gender roles are biologically or culturally determined, an argument which I think is stupid because it's clear that they are both. Obviously, the specific social norms about gender relations are highly relative to each particular society in which they occur, emerging out of complex factors, including people's history, their economy, and religious beliefs. And hence, you see different expectations and etiquette surrounding gender across different cultures. But I think it's equally clear that the underlying bones of all these systems are grounded in biological realities, namely, men as the procurers of resources, the risk takers, the preservers of lore, and women as the allocators of resources within the household, the nurturers, and the risk averse. These functions are grounded in biological realities that I sadly don't have the time to delve into here, but may do so in a future video. This dynamic is so ancient, its origin is lost in the mist of antiquity and has characterized the overwhelming majority of human societies. For 99% of human history, it never entered into anybody's head to even question this dynamic because it seemed so self evidently part of the natural order of things. But beginning in the 20th century, there was an increasing belief that modern technocratic society had empowered us to unshackle ourselves from these traditional gender roles. It began with the redefinition of the legal rights of men and women, followed up with the reclassification of their respective roles within the workplace and society. But where the scale really tipped was with the sexual revolution that followed the introduction of the birth control pill, enabling people to free themselves from even the biological constraints of nature. Now, the feminists argued that this advance would be beneficial by freeing women from the necessity of bearing more children than their health or the family finances could bear. But the more prescient saw in this the seeds of the total overthrow of the gender relations that had existed since time immemorial. Women are, after all, the gatekeepers of sex, and men are the gatekeepers of commitment. Traditionally, sex is exchanged for commitment ratified in the bond of marriage. This means that the same blow that freed women from the risk of pregnancy simultaneously freed men from the obligation of commitment. This gave rise to the astronomical increase in divorce, infidelity, the emergence of hookup culture, and all the sexual ills of the modern world. But this was not enough. Not content with overthrowing traditional gender relations and sexual norms, increasingly radical incarnations of feminism attacked biology itself. First, pushing for acceptance of sexual relations between people of the same sex, and then dismantling the binary nature of biological sex itself. This ushered in the age of trans rights, pronouns, so called gender affirming care, and all the insanity that we are grappling with today. And as we saw in the case of the liturgical revolution, it's not just that these things are pushed as positive goods, but that traditional gender roles and even the binary view of sexuality is attacked and demonized. The malicious totalitarian nature of the gender revolution is particularly alarming. Who would have thought that a mere 10 years ago that simply saying a man can't have a baby or a woman doesn't have a penis could lead to social ostracism and even loss of employment? Part 3: National Identity. The political world today is in absolute chaos. People are trying to make sense of it in various ways, and most of them are stupidly short sighted. What we are seeing, I think, is the complete collapse of the liberal order that was ushered in after World War II, which is sometimes referred to as the Bretton Woods system. Look that up if you're not familiar with the term. In a bigger sense, it's the collapse of the nation state as an entity that exists to further the aims of a particular people, and its replacement by a technocratic managerial class. A class who view populations as interchangeable cogs in a machine and countries as nothing more than economic zones. Nowhere is this transformation more readily visible than in debates about migration, both in the United States and Europe. The managerial elites who have come to power in the West see populations as entirely interchangeable. They import 800,000 Afghan and Pakistani migrants into Britain because they argue it's needed to keep GDP at certain levels. It doesn't matter who these people are, what sort of culture shaped them, what moral values they hold, what religion they profess, what political institutions they are used to. All of these things are irrelevant so long as they can boost employment by a few percentage points each quarter. Now, whether this scheme is economically viable is beside the point, and I personally believe it's not. As in places like England or Germany, for example, unemployment amongst first generation migrant communities is often as high as 40%, while they simultaneously put a disproportionate burden on public services. But I'm more interested here in the philosophy that underlies this push for just endless migration. The original rationale for the emergence of the nation state in the early modern period was the concept of national identity, that the interests of ethnically French people should be represented by a French state which was characteristically French, or that the interests of German people should be vested in a government body that was uniquely German and acted with the good of Germans in mind, and so on with all the nation states of the West. This, of course, presumed that a given people were an objective reality with their own defining characteristics, their own language, culture, life ways, an entire cultural identity inherited from generations past and sanctified by that people's bond with a specific piece of land. The nation state was instituted as the political expression of this people to secure their common good and protect their lifeways so that this culture could be handed on as an inheritance to future generations. Now, I am not saying that early modern nationalism is perfect or above criticism by any means. I'm merely explaining the sociopolitical theory upon which it was constructed, and which does have a core of truth, namely the people as an objectively recognizable entity that can be identified by certain cultural characteristics. To be English is fundamentally different than to be German, and that difference goes way beyond just what piece of geographic territory one happens to be residing and working in. Now, this concept of a heritable national identity is anathema to the managerial elite who see all people as mutually exchangeable. I recently did a video called Make England Merry Again, in which I argued that Keir Starmer and those who share his worldview do not view the English as a people, nor England as a place. They view England as an economic zone and English as a descriptor for any person who happens to be living and working in that economic zone. By this definition, an Afghan Muslim who stumbles onto the beach at Dover off a refugee raft and obtains legal residency is as much an Englishman as a resident of the Oxfordshire countryside whose family have been farming that land since the time of the Tudors. Nationality for the managerial elite must be reduced to an abstraction. It must cease being a concrete thing defined by a people's ethnicity and historic ties to the land, and it must become an idea, a mere label that denotes only an administrative reality and nothing more. Similarly, in the United States, there is this notion that America is just an idea, not a geographic place with a historic population grounded in certain cultural traditions. I find it interesting that if you read American political literature and social commentary that predates the 1960s, you see that the United States was unapologetically considered a European endeavor. Now, obviously, the United States is a different kind of place than somewhere like Germany or Italy that were more ethnically homogenous, but it was still overwhelmingly settled by people of European ancestry who shared a system of values and assumptions about the world, largely determined by their common Christian heritage from Europe. It was simply taken for granted that the United States was a white Christian nation. And while I would never suggest that this means that people who do not fit that descriptor are unwelcome here, it does not change the fact that this is how the United States was conceived by its founders and how it was considered until very recently within living memory. Whether this view is right or wrong is beside the point. The fact is, this was the traditional view. Now, because of that, American immigration policy up to the 1960s was incredibly restrictive, utilizing a quota system whereby the United States government decided on a country by country basis how many immigrants they wished to take in annually, specifically considering how an immigrant's particular skill set could fit the needs of the American economy and how likely immigrants from certain countries were believed to be able to blend in with the American society. Today, the federal government has essentially abandoned any attempt to manage immigration levels, whether legal or illegal. And this is because the mentality has fundamentally changed. The manager elites who control our country no longer consider Americans to have any objectively definable traits, much less those that are European or Christian. In previous generations, migration was managed under the expectation of Americanization. That is, the immigrant was expected to assimilate into the larger host population. This, of course, is easier to the degree that the immigrant and the host population already share a certain cultural tradition, but more fundamentally, it presumes that the host population has an objective defining characteristic to begin with, that there is a demographic core of the country to be assimilated into. This concept has been completely erased. What does it even mean to be an American today? Any reference to ethnicity, religion, family, ties to the land, history, or language will immediately be decried as racist or xenophobic. For the managerial elites, to be American can be nothing other than an abstraction, something that applies to basically anyone who exists administratively within these borders, pays their taxes, and eats McDonald's and watches Netflix, I guess. The point is that nationality is considered a blank slate. a title the technocratic managers of our society bestow upon whomever they wish. Like Jesus Christ, who once said that God could turn stones into children of Abraham, our elites point to a Haitian, Afghani, or Rwandan and say, this too is an Englishman. Part 4 Cinema. I don't spend all my time in the Catholic space. In my spare moments, I'm actually quite fond of following the world of cinema. I'm very interested in the craft of filmmaking, both in its expressive and technical aspects, and I consume a lot of content relating to the film industry. There's an older video on this channel I recommend you watch called Fan Blaming and Traddy Shaming. In this video, I highlight some striking parallels between the state of Hollywood and the Catholic Church. I'm not going to recap that entire video here, so I do suggest you give it a watch when you have time. But essentially, the argument I made is that modern cinema is characterized by a revolutionary transformation in the way cinematic franchises are viewed and treated. I think anyone with any inkling of sense can tell that modern Hollywood is creatively bankrupt. For the past 15 years, almost every major studio project has been a reboot, remake, or adaptation of previously existing franchises that were created during a more vibrant age. Now, remakes, of course, are nothing new. Many of my favorite movies from the 1980s were, in fact, remakes of earlier films from the 1950s. But what's different about today is the transformation of the franchise into the intellectual property or IP. What defines a cinema franchise? From a writing perspective, it's a common body of lore that sets the parameters of the fictional world wherein the story is set. The lore lays down the ground rules, so to speak, of what we are to expect in the franchise. It tells us how things function and gives a particular flavor to the installments in the franchise as successive films built upon this shared lore endow the series with a certain feel that we recognize and are comfortable with. This accumulation of lore is sometimes called canon, signifying the customs or rules a franchise must follow to maintain its identity and keep continuity with previous installments. Skilled writers and directors are adept at using the framework provided by the canon to build creative stories that use the lore to draw out perennial themes of interest to audiences. It is this concept of an inherited lore or canon that is increasingly under attack in modern Hollywood. And this is why there is such controversy and vitriol surrounding, for example, the live action remakes of classical Disney movies or the modern installments in the Star Wars and Marvel franchises, which many fans accuse of blatantly violating the accepted lore of each respective series, to the point where projects with the Star Wars label bear almost nothing in common with the traditional Star Wars universe fans had come to know and love. Let's look at this in some greater detail using one of my favorite science fiction franchises, Star Trek. Now, Star Trek is known for its incredible amount of detail in its lore, which we won't dig into here as much as I'd like to, but rather let's consider the big picture. What is the fundamental idea behind Star Trek? What is Star Trek ultimately about? Star Trek is about an optimistic future of humanity, where technology has helped us solve our material needs. Poverty and hunger have been eliminated. The human race has become a spacefaring people whose leadership is characterized by competent professionals who use reason and science to solve difficulties through a shared commitment to the principles of compromise, empathy, and humanity. It is essentially a view of what the human race could become if we were ever to escape the thraldom of our baser passions and material inequalities. It's a happy vision of the future where everything turns out all right. Is this unrealistic? Sure, but that doesn't matter because we're talking about science fiction. The point is, this is the underlying ideal of Star Trek. This is the philosophical framework that makes Star Trek Star Trek. Every installment of Star Trek has to work within this basic premise. And that's what you see with the original series, Next Generation, Deep Space Nine, and Voyager, what are known as classic Star Trek. which all responsibly expanded the Star Trek lore within the confines established by the canon. But in modern Trek, which is dominated by the baleful influence of Alex Kurtzman, we see this fundamental canon is disregarded. Modern Trek, like Discovery and Picard, depict a dark vision of humanity's future, full of inequality, xenophobia, brutality, exploitation, and intrigue. The Federation is not an efficient institution managed by competent professionals, but by crude, corrupt, immature people dominated by their emotions. Given this radical discontinuity, we are justified in asking in what sense any of this is even Star Trek. I'm not exaggerating the disconnect between old and new Star Trek. Indeed, the new Star Trek has fouled up the lore so badly that modern Trek actually has something called the Kelvin timeline, which is a deus ex machina invoked to explain away a lot of the Alex Kurtzman mess ups by suggesting that the new Trek movies actually happen in an entirely different alternate universe from classic Trek. But back to the main point. What does it even mean for something to be Star Trek? Is it Star Trek because it has the Star Trek label? Because you trot out an elderly Patrick Stewart? Because Klingons show up? Or is it something more fundamental? If successive iterations of traditional franchises consistently violate the very premises those franchises were built upon to begin with, in what sense are we still even dealing with the same franchise? When Amazon's new Rings of Power series tries to laughably present orcs as sympathetic, family oriented creatures who just want to do what's best for their people, in what sense are we still talking about the Middle Earth created by J.R.R. Tolkien? The studios predictably respond by blaming the fans and calling them all sorts of names: racist, incel, toxic, sexist, reactionary, and so on. That is the only way they can process these criticisms because ultimately they resent the binding nature of lore and canon. For them, a franchise is just an intellectual property. It's a bundle of iconic logos, MacGuffins, and marketing material that can be employed to serve whatever story the studio committee wants to tell, regardless of whether it contradicts the established lore. What do you mean, is it Star Wars? Of course it's Star Wars. Look at the lightsabers. Of course this is Tolkien. Look at the pointy ears. Of course this is Star Trek. There's a Romulan. The franchise becomes a blank slate to tell whatever story the showrunners decide. Completely unshackled from the structure of the inherited lore, they can create new themes and new stories they deem more suitable to modern audiences, while simultaneously leaving behind outdated, problematic elements from the original lore and just tossing in a few member berries here and there for the illusion of continuity. The objective content of the franchise becomes less important. The franchise becomes just a marketing device to push the new agenda. Part 5: The War on Identity. This has all been quite a lengthy detour, but a necessary detour to understand the scope of the problem. The thread that ties all these issues together is a war against identity, where identity is understood as something objective, heritable, and fixed. In essence, there is a comprehensive attempt to overthrow the concept of a thing being defined by certain essential properties in favor of a newer definition where a thing is whatever we want it to be. Christianity no longer consists in an objective body of doctrines and rituals. It is now ritually and theologically fluid, becoming whatever modern man wishes it to be. Humans are no longer understood as male and female with specific roles grounded in biological sex. Sex and gender are dismissed as social constructs people can identify as whatever they wish. A nationality is no longer designated based on objective, heritable traits grounded in a specific people and location. It is an abstract idea, a label the state can give to anyone. A creative franchise is no longer determined by an objective body of content adhering to standards delineated by lore and canon. It's an intellectual property that can tell any story the studio wishes, unencumbered by the constraints imposed upon it by its creators. Across the entire gambit of human culture, identities grounded in the objective structure of a thing are being attacked, overthrown, and replaced by artificial identities that are entirely fabricated. There's probably even more facets of society this is happening in if I were to think about it more, but you get the point. It's why you feel like you're at war against everything. It's why everything feels like such a struggle. It's why everything around us feels so fake and gay because we are constantly being told that a thing is not what it is and then being gaslit into believing something is wrong with us if we question the plain evidence of our senses. I think ultimately it is the liberal blank slate concept run amok. Nothing is a given. The entire world is raw material to be arranged or rearranged however its managers see fit. People, institutions, cultures, artistic creations, even biology itself, it's all completely interchangeable. Nothing is different from anything else. The goal of all this is to create a world where there is not a single objective, heritable reality that could possibly stand in the way of our technocracy conjuring whatever reality it wishes into being. There can be no identity other than the administrative abstractions assigned by the powers that be, who have, for all intents and purposes, assumed the status of technocratic gods.